I was part of a small group of pastors that gathered for a spiritual retreat in the mountains of Colorado. And while I was there, I learned about the life and ministry of John Lewis Dyer. Father Dyer, as he was commonly known, was a Midwestern Methodist minister riding the circuit in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And in 1861, he was afraid he was losing his eyesight. So he headed west because he wanted to see Pikes Peak and the Rocky Mountains while he still could. Now his horse broke down in Nebraska, in Omaha. So he then walked the 600 miles to Denver as part of a wagon train. Once he got to Denver, he reconnected with a son who had settled there, but he then walked another 100 miles to Park County, Colorado. As you might imagine, the 700 miles of walking had leaned out his body and renewed his vigor. So he resumed preaching. He went to the Methodist conference that was in Colorado and received authority to begin preaching in the mining camps from South Park. And yes, one of the creators of that long-running animated series hails from that area, to the Continental Divide. And preaching against gambling, drinking, and prostitution. Now, you might imagine this didn't always make him the most popular guy in those mining camps. But Father Dyer became a beloved and iconic figure to the people of that area, and indeed to the state of Colorado. He supplemented his very small salary as a circuit rider by carrying the mail, often skiing up and down the mountains. He called them snowshoes, but they really were cross-country skis. Preaching in the mining camps, often in the saloons where he was preaching against the drinking, 3 days a week. And then 3 times on Sundays. He became so trusted that miners trusted him enough to take their gold to the office where it could be weighed and valued, and then brought the money back to the miners. Now, I hope you realize just how deeply then Father Dyer was trusted by the folk. He performed marriages, he tended to the sick, and he preached a message of hope to people who lived hard, scrabbled lives, very often on the razor's edge of survival. He literally built a church in Breckenridge, what's now Breckenridge, Colorado. It's now known as Father Dyer United Methodist Church. He also created a small hotel or rooming house for infirm and disabled miners, so they'd have someplace safe and secure to stay. And today, there is a stained glass window of him in the church. That's the one on the right, on the skis. And in the Colorado State House. That's the one on the left. Now, my experiences in learning all of this, and certainly being in the geographical context where it happened, because even in the 21st century, it was a challenge to get from point A to point B in many parts of that area. It gave me a much deeper appreciation of the people who lived during that time and in that place. Especially my Methodist preacher forebears. So between him and Melville B. Cox, the first Methodist missionary to Liberia, who was a circuit rider that had lost his wife and children to disease, and he himself had been very ravaged by that. So he said, I can't handle being a circuit riding preacher. It's too much for me. So send me, I'll go to Liberia, because if I die, it's no great loss. And he did die within like 90 days of landing in Liberia. Kind of a sobering thing to learn as Barbara and I were preparing to take our children over there. But Melville Cox and Father Dyer, they're just a couple of our forebears who made that kind of an impact. Now, you and I know, I hope we know, how important love is in our lives. In today's lesson from Matthew's Gospel, we heard about the Pharisees getting together because the Sadducees that just had their hat handed back to them in a previous encounter where they tried to put Jesus in some sort of a box. And so someone who was well-versed in the law, when they say the law, it's the law of Moses, said, "Okay, teacher, you're so smart. What's the greatest commandment?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind." That's the greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Kind of like 1A and 1B. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Everything else flows from that. And we've heard those words so many times, but they're still breathtaking. Everything that it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ can be boiled down to those two simple commandments. Love is at the center of our faith. We can't minimize the importance of these verses. That's what Christian faith is all about. Love for God and love for one's neighbor. And we need to remember this really was nothing new. Because those verses can be found in what we now know as the Old Testament. When Jesus was asked about the law, the New Testament hadn't been written yet. So he was reminding the Pharisees of what the Jewish scriptures already said. Because Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. Now, though barely known in Europe and the Americas, like Mother Teresa, a woman by the name of Amy Carmichael made a name for herself in India, where she touched the lives of thousands of women. Carmichael was born and raised at the end of the 19th century in a Presbyterian home in Ireland. When she turned 16, she packed up her things, she moved to Belfast. Her goal was to establish a Presbyterian mission for women who worked in the mills. And she was very successful at that. The membership in her mission eventually grew to over 500 women. But Amy Carmichael knew that wasn't really what she wanted to do with her life. Her ultimate goal was to be a missionary overseas. And she got her opportunity. After a brief stint in Japan, she was posted to India. She had a strong spirit, thankfully, because the hot and unfriendly climate of India did not deter her from fulfilling her dream, neither did the dangers that missionaries often encounter. Another sobering fact, missionaries that went overseas often packed all of their belongings, their effects, in wooden boxes that would be big enough to serve as their coffins. And she suffered dreadfully from neuralgia, which oftentimes left her no choice but to run her mission from her bed. And when her condition got even worse, she was moved back to her home in Ireland. And after a period of rest, she went back to India, stronger, better, and this time channeled her efforts to rescuing young Indian women who were working as prostitutes in Hindu temples. It's part of the history of Hinduism not many of us are aware of. And she was very effective at that. And instead of returning home after completing her assignment, she chose to remain in India. She went as far as dyeing her skin with coffee so that it would match the people she was working with. And that allowed her to also travel more safely around the country. She spent the last 75 years of her life in India without even setting her foot back in Ireland. And sadly, she suffered paralysis for the last 20 years thanks to a bad fall. The neuralgia she suffered did not make things easy in any way, yet her efforts eventually led the government to ban temple prostitution in India in 1948. And after her death, she was buried in India. The children she saved erected a bird bath over her grave with the word Amah, which means mother, in the language of the Tamil people of India. Love is at the center of our faith. Father Dyer and Carmichael personified that love. We think of the Apostle Paul's great words, if I speak in the tongues of men or angels but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. I think that the skeptical eye with which the world regards Christians today would quickly be transformed into admiration and respect if we simply lived out those two central teachings of the Master. Love is essential to our faith as followers of Jesus Christ. Love is also essential to our emotional and our physical well-being. A study was made years ago of 97 babies, 3 months to 3 years in age, in a South American children's home. These babies were well fed, they were clothed, they got good medical attention, but there was no one to love on them or play with. After several months, those babies began to lose their appetites. Their health started to decline. Within 2 years, 34 were dead, and 21 were beginning to have numerous physical and emotional problems. Their lives had been destroyed for only one reason. They had everything but love. They were emotionally starved. Pastor John Ortberg tells about an exhaustive research project on relationships called the Alameda County Study. It was headed by a Harvard social scientist and tracked the lives of 7,000 people over 9 years. Researchers found that the most isolated people were 3 times more likely to die than those with strong relational connections. People who had bad health habits, like smoking, poor eating habits, obesity, alcohol use, but they had strong social ties, lived significantly longer than people who had great health habits but were isolated. Ortberg then quipped, and I guess it's better to eat Twinkies with good friends than to eat broccoli alone. Harvard researcher Robert Putnam noted that if you belong to no groups when you decide to join one, you cut your risk of dying over the next year in half. Hey, those of you that have been resisting being part of a Sunday school class or a smaller spiritual growth group, do I need to say anything more about that? You might want to rethink your desire to do everything by yourself, huh? I mean, that's how powerful love is. It's essential to our physical and emotional well-being. The prominent psychiatrist, Carl Menninger, was featured in an article in the Chicago Daily News, back when that was a newspaper, titled "Love Working Miracles for the Mentally Ill in Kansas." And Dr. Menninger contended that love is one of the most effective cures in healing mental illness. When reporters asked Menninger how it was that 80% of his patients recovered, he replied the secret was not in electroshock therapy or surgery or group therapy or psychiatric drugs. I mean, they all played a part. But the real secret was contained in that four-letter word, love. And finally, love is our primary calling as followers of Jesus. How will the world know we're Christians? By our love. John 13:35, by this everyone will know you are my disciples if you love one another. Love is our primary calling as disciples of Jesus Christ. Love for God and love for our neighbors. Now, Lawrence Lemieux hails from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And he didn't win a gold or a silver or a bronze medal at the 1988 Olympics in Seoul, South Korea. But he actually won something even better. Very experienced sailor. He was well on his way to clinching silver in his particular sail class competition. And competing in the Olympics had been his lifelong dream. But then something happened that no one ever expected. Two other sailors were racing close to him when they lost control of their boats. Some really rough seas that day. When Lemieux noticed them, they had already capsized. They were struggling in the water. They were injured, barely staying afloat. Without a second thought, Lemieux abandoned the race and rescued his fellow sportsmen, bringing them aboard his boat and carrying them then to the rescue boat. But unfortunately, that bravery and sportsmanship cost him the silver medal, which was right there for him up to that point. In fact, he finished 23rd. But his act of bravery wasn't about to be forgotten. At the closing ceremony of the 1988 Olympics, organizers of the Games rewarded his efforts by awarding him a medal awarded to athletes who display an exceptional spirit of sportsmanship. In an interview after the Olympics, he said, "As a sailor, your duty first is to people in distress. Medals can follow afterwards." He said he only wanted to do what was right, not to be a hero. Now, you and I will probably never compete in the Olympics or any other world stage. But each of us can reach out and we can make a difference in the life of someone who's struggling. Someone who may just be about to go under. A Methodist preacher who thought he was wearing down as a circuit rider named John Dyer. He did that. Not in Colorado. An Olympic athlete did that. Who is there that you and I can show Christian love to? Who do we know that is struggling that we can reach out to and pull to safety? Teacher, which is the greatest commandment of the law? They really didn't want to know the answer to that. They were trying to set Jesus up. But Jesus knew the answer. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That says it all. Love is at the center of our faith. It's essential to our physical and our emotional well-being, and it is our primary calling as followers of Jesus. Today is a day in the life of the church when we mark, remember, and celebrate love in a special way. As we remember those who are members of our church, who were members of our church, or loved ones, others outside the church that we know and love. So I invite you first to join me in the prayer as we mark this day. Let's pray together. We give you thanks, O God, for all the saints who ever worshiped you, whether in brush arbors or cathedrals, whether wooden churches or crumbling cement meeting houses, where your name was lifted and adored. We give you thanks, O God, for hands lifted in praise, manicured hands, and hands stained with grease or soil, strong hands, and those gnarled with age, holy hands, used as wave offerings across the land. We thank you, God, for hard-working saints, whether hard-hatted or steel-booted, head ragged or apron, blue-collared or three-piece suited. They left their mark on the earth for you, for us, for our children to come. Thank you, God, for the tremendous sacrifices made by those who have gone before us. Bless the memories of your saints, God. May we learn how to walk wisely from their examples of faith, dedication, worship, and love. As we light a candle and toll a bell for the members of our church that have died in the past year, I invite you, if you had a special relationship with that person being named, to stand in respect as their name is read. Maria Cheeks. Raymond Bud Ray. Robin Halberstadt. Lon G. Price. Many of you have lost loved ones this past year that were not members of our church, but still hold sacred memory for you. If that's the case, we invite you to come if you're able and get these candles to light. To light one of the small candles here on the kneeler. You can take the flame from the pillar candle using the taper and then light the small candles. And as all these no doubt prayed, let us pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. I invite you to stand if you're able as we sing together.